Sometimes in our spiritual lives, sometimes a person will fall into the same sins again and again. And sometimes people, they struggle against the same sins for a long period of time, and sometimes they start questioning, why am I not getting any better? Why is this still happening? And sometimes the reason is the person may need to make changes in their lives. Sometimes they're too attached to certain things. They're not willing to give up certain things. There may be many reasons as to why that is happening, but sometimes it's also to keep a person humble, to remind a person that they are not as good as they might think they are. But sometimes it also happens that a person can become very discouraged and think, oh, what's the point of trying? I might as well just give up. There's no hope for me. And this is a very big mistake. So no matter what sins we may be struggling with, even someone who may be struggling with mortal sin, the reality is that there's the habit of sin. So when someone converts, they may have a lot of bad habits. And it's not so easy to overcome those habits. So even though our sins are forgiven through the sacrament of confession, the habit remains, and the force of the habit remains. So the person has to struggle against that. They have to choose ever more clearly in their lives for God. Often there's still attachment to the habit. There's still attachment to the sin. But the whole point is that we should never give up. And in today's gospel reading, we have this quotation from the book of the prophet Isaiah pertaining to Christ and the kingdom that he will establish. And I mentioned before that sometimes the book of the prophet Isaiah has been referred to as the fifth gospel because there's so many references to Christ and his kingdom and just prophecies pertaining to Christ. But notice how it mentions he will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. So his kingdom will spread to all nations, the Gentiles will be able to hope in him. But this bruised reed, he will not break a bruised reed. In other words, usually when people are using reeds for various things, if they see one that is bruised, they'll break it and they'll throw it aside because it's weak. It's not good for, whatever they want to build with it. Or a smoldering wick. Well, why keep the smoldering wick going? It's just producing smoke. There's no flame. Just extinguish it. That's what most people would do. But it's saying that Christ will not do this. And it's an analogy for us. Sometimes we are like a broken reed. We have faults. We have shortcomings. Sometimes we are like a smoldering wick. We're not aflame with the love of God. But God is not going to extinguish even that tiny smoldering ember. In other words, there's always hope for us. And we should never despair of God's love, no matter how terrible a person may be in regards to their attachment to sin. But they need to keep trying. They need to be just with themselves. They need to acknowledge their sinfulness. They need to use the resources that God has given us, the sacraments of confession, Holy Communion, of course, and of course, an intense prayer life. But this is also, I wanted to relate this to today's feast, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Now, it's just an optional memorial. Unfortunately, I think it should be a much greater feast, to honor Our Lady. And it's important to know something about Mount Carmel. So in the book of Kings, chapter 18 in the book of Kings, if you want to look it up, I think it starts around verse 15, but the first book of Kings, the prophet Elijah, he is one of the few remaining prophets of God. In other words, the prophets of God, the followers of God, were persecuted. And these false religions, these false prophets, they just spread and prospered. So here's Elijah and a few others like him, and it's kind of like, well, what's the point of trying? We're battling all these other prophets, all these false religions. We might as well just give up and join them. Well, no. They persevere, and God blesses their perseverance. And in that chapter, verse 8, in that chapter 18, it talks about how the king is persecuting the prophet Elijah, and Elijah says, let's not beat around the bush. Let's decide once and for all who has the true God. And so he proposes a challenge, and he asks the king to summon all of Israel, so all the Israelites, all the people, even though they strayed, most of them have strayed from God, as well as the false prophets. And there's to come and meet on Mount Carmel. And basically there's 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherahs, or I can't remember exactly, but I know there's 2 false gods. So in other words, there's 850 false prophets against the lone Elijah. And the Israelites, the people, are all gathered to watch this spectacle. And so Elijah proposes, okay, let's get 2 young bulls, and you slaughter one, I'll slaughter the other one, and we both offer them up to our God. And the God that responds with fire, in other words, the God that consumes the sacrifice through fire, is the true God. And so the false prophets go first, and from noon, from morning until noon, they're praying and asking God and begging God and making a great commotion, and nothing is happening. And so Elijah just mocks them and says, maybe your gods are asleep, wake them up. And they even slash themselves. So there's blood, they're covered in blood. It's kind of like they're offering sacrifices to their gods. So, and nothing happens. And then it's Elijah's turn. So he prepares the altar and he slaughters the young bull. And he says to them, here's 4 big, huge containers. Fill them with water and pour it over this sacrifice, this oblation to God. And he tells them to do that 3 times. And they do it. So this sacrifice is drenched in water. And yet, when Elijah prays to the true God, God does respond. A flame of fire comes down and consumes not just the bull, but the wood and even the stones that were there. And the people are amazed. The people realize that Elijah has the true God. And after this, Elijah orders all the false prophets to be captured, to be taken into captivity, and he slaughters all of them. He slits their throat. So this indicates the final victory of God and the importance of perseverance, even though we may be the last person, the only person who's standing for the truth, that we should never, ever despair. So it's kind of important to know the significance of this, because in the 13th century, hermits went to Mount Carmel, and they kind of, spent time there, and they eventually formed a community which eventually became known as the Carmelites. But they had an altar dedicated to Our Lady. And on this date, July 16th, I can't remember the year, but Our Lady appeared to St. Simon Stock, who I believe was the superior of that community at that time, and she gave him the brown scapular, which is the symbol or the distinguishing trademark or the habit of the Carmelites. And many people will wear the brown scapular of Our Lady, the miniature version that you just wear around your neck. So all the promises attached to it, that if you die wearing it and you observe the requirements for purity and devotion to Our Lady, that Our Lady will help you at the time of death and you will have a very short purgatory. So all the more reason to be enrolled in the brown scapular. But if you recall, Our Lady is the one who crushes the head of the serpent. We read in Genesis 3:15 how God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall strike your heel, but he shall crush your head. So in other words, it's Our Lady who crushes the head of the serpent. So she is like the prophet Elijah, who will slaughter or put aside or dispel all these false prophets. So devotion to Our Lady. And Our Lady, of course, leads us to Christ. She doesn't require devotion for herself. That's not why she wants us to have a devotion. God, through her, wants to give us his love, but through her wants to give us a mother's love also, a love that we can relate to. And so we should have a great devotion to Our Lady. And if a person is struggling with sin, especially if it's more serious sin, the greater devotion they have to Our Lady, the better. The more it will help them, and especially devotion to the Most Holy Rosary, to try to pray it daily, but also to wear the brown scapular. So it's a good devotion. There's so many devotions out there, we can't do all of them, but I think these are two very important ones. In fact, when we think of the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, on the very final day, Our Lady appeared as Our Lady of Mount Carmel, holding the brown scapular in her hand, offering it to mankind. And she had warned that there would be a lot of impurity in the time to come after her apparitions, and that many souls go to hell because of sins of the flesh, sins of impurity. As you can see, we've put the statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel up in the front. Normally she's up in the corner there, and a lot of people don't really see her because it's a small statue. It's kind of far away. They're not even aware that we have Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So on the fourth Saturday, I think the Carmelites come and meet, and they will actually take the statue and put it in the hall when they have their meeting. So we have a third order of Carmelites that meet here once a month. But if you wanted to venerate the statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she is there in the front.